right now you can get nearly 60% APR real yield on BTC using Contango. But also you will be exposed to ZeroLend, Babylon, Pendle, potentially EtherFi, and also potentially Lombard. Now that is a whole bunch of protocols doing a whole bunch of things, so I'm going to break this down. Let's dive in. One other thing I want you to know before we start is that on top of that 60% real yield, you'll also be getting 35x gravity points, maybe even 30x additional Lux points if you use the LBTC market, and another 9x gravity points on your debt. So there's a bunch of additional points that may precipitate into some inevitable realizable yield in the future, but I'm just looking at the real yield. So I'm looking at that 60%. If I get anything on top of that, that is a happy surprise that I will gladly take. The first thing you need to understand is what a PT asset is. So we'll just jump over to Pendle and I'll give you a very quick explanation. If you click BTC, you will see a bunch of these yield derivative markets with a YT and a PT. We're going to focus on the PT, which is a fixed date, fixed rate yield derivative for these assets. For example, if I click on this PT for Lombard BTC, what I see is an 8.39% fixed rate, fixed date yield that expires in 78 days. Let's just say I take one LBTC to mint a PT LBTC against it. I will receive 1.0171 PT LBTC. Now, in 78 days, I can redeem that PT LBTC for 1.0171 LBTC, actualizing an ROI of 1.71%. And if you annualize that, you will get 8.15% fixed rate, fixed date APR. When you mint that PT LBTC, you can also take that over to ZeroLend, collateralize it, get an extra 5 bips in Zero token, and every bip counts, and borrow against that at a 90% max LTV. Now, for the math nerds out there, if you wanted to know what your max leverage is with the max LTV, all you have to do is do 1 divided by, in parentheses, 1 minus max LTV. So in this case, it would be 1 divided by 0.1, which is 10. So at a max LTV of 90%, you have a max leverage of 10x. And once you know your max leverage, it's really easy to estimate your total max leverage yield. What you do is take the arbitrage, the difference between your collateral yield, let's just call it 8%, and your borrow cost, let's just call it 3%. So it's 5% arbitrage, 5% difference between the collateral yield and the borrow cost. Multiply that by leverage minus 1. So in this case, 10 minus 1 is 9. So 5 times 9 is 45%. And then add that to your collateral yield, which is 8%. So 45% plus 8% is 53%. That's a ballpark, and it's really close to what we're seeing here with this 56 and 52. So we know that these numbers are roughly accurate. And the next most important thing to know and understand is the oracle. Whenever you're leveraging derivatives, you absolutely need to understand what your oracle risks are, because they tell you what your liquidation risk is. Luckily, ZeroLend is an Aave v3 fork, which makes it really easy to find your oracle. If you click on the market, you can click on the oracle and look at the contract. I'll save you the headache and tell you this is a Pendle AMM oracle. What that means is it uses the Pendle market price for the asset. So if you go back over to Pendle to that market, click on price, you will see the price denominated in LBTC. Now, that's pretty important because it means that if LBTC depegs, the PT asset will also depeg in USD value, but it won't change in LBTC value. So if you're borrowing anything except for LBTC against it, you are exposed to liquidation risks. Luckily, Contango only allows you to borrow the principal against the derivative. So if you're leveraging PT LBTC, you can only borrow LBTC against it. So depegs do not expose you to any additional risk. Likewise for the PTE BTC market, but there is one liquidation risk that you should know about, and that is what can cause this number to go down. The only thing that can cause this number to go down instead of up and to the right is a massive increase in the implied yield of this market. So right now, the implied yield is 8.35%. What that means is you would need the implied yield to increase to 32% in order to experience liquidation. So I've entered all these numbers in, I built this calculator. Effectively, what this is saying is the PT value is currently 0.98 LBTC. It will expire at 1 LBTC. In order for you to get liquidated, it would have to go down to 0.93 LBTC. For that to happen, the implied yield would have to spike all the way up to 32% for 30 minutes because the Oracle uses a time-weighted average price. Now, that is highly unlikely, but not impossible. The reason why it's highly unlikely is because if I'm a yield farmer and I see a fixed rate, fixed date yield on LBTC or a BTC derivative of over 20%, I'm going to buy that up immediately, and so are many other market makers, arbitrageurs, and strategists. That means it is highly unlikely that the fixed rate, fixed date yield will stay above 20% for any meaningful amount of time, even more than 5 minutes. But it is not impossible, and it is one concern you should think about. Now, on the bright side, as you get closer to expiry, the IY required for liquidation increases exponentially. So let's just say once you get 50 days away from expiry, you would need a 50% IY. Once you're 30 days away, you would need an 84% IY. And once you're 10 days away, you would need it to spike to over 250% implied yield to trigger a liquidation. So that is the main risk that you definitely should know about. And when you open your position, you should manage accordingly. So let's go back over to BTC and talk about opening a position. When you click Create Position, you will come to this screen. And there are a few things you need to know. First is you determine your leverage. And so you can change your leverage so you have a larger liquidation threshold if you want to. At 9x leverage, your effective LTV is going to be somewhere around 88%. So we can go back over here and say 88%, and you can see that everything sort of changes. It requires a much higher IY, yada, yada, yada. So if you want to reduce your liquidation risk, absolutely do that through lower leverage. But the other thing you need to consider is the estimated entry price, because this is really going to tell you what your overall yield or return is going to be. Here, because the entry price, the difference between that price and what we will redeem it at expiry, which is 1, is roughly 1.16%. Now, if you're 10x leverage, that means a 16% ROI, which is phenomenal for a 78-day yield. That's insane. However, you do need to discount the borrow cost, which is, right now it's 3% times 10x leverage. Let's call it roughly 30 or 27% APR you're paying on your principal. Let's just call it for 3 months. So you're paying 30% for 3 months. That's a quarter of a year. A quarter of that is roughly 4%. So you're going to pay 4% to 5% in interest. But if you're getting a 6% ROI, that's 11%. That is an 11% net ROI in 78 days, all else equal if the interest rates stay the same. That is amazing. But remember your major risks. 1, crazy high IY for some reason, right? If the implied yield spikes dramatically for a long period of time, you can get liquidated. I say this is highly unlikely, but possible. The second risk is an interest rate spike. So currently the interest rates are between 2 and 3% because they're getting a ton of points for supplying. I mean, look at supplying EtherFi. You're getting 10 different kinds of points. For Lombard, you're getting 4 different kinds of points. And this is awesome and amazing and highly subsidized, which keeps these borrow rates really low. But if these incentive programs ended, there's a chance these spike up and you would have a net negative yielding position. And if you do have a net negative yielding position, that means your debt is increasing faster than your collateral. And so your debt can increase all the way to the liquidation threshold and liquidate you if you are not actively monitoring it. So that is one thing you definitely have to be watching while in this position. I will say these have been highly subsidized and have hovered around these rates And the biggest bottleneck here hasn't been the interest rate, but it's been the caps on the collateral. I'm amazed that these have not been filled yet, but there you go. Anyways, these are two of my favorite positions currently on Contango. It is mind-blowing to me that we have over 30% APR on Bitcoin and DeFi that's been consistent. Do remember your risks. Also know I am a Contango ambassador, highly biased to showcase these yields, and have a wonderful rest of your day.